Welcome to one of three tech talks we're conducting here at WAF Virtual today. It's my great pleasure to introduce one of our supporters, VM Zinc, and this session will discuss that marvelous material. Some of you will know that at WAF last year, VM Zinc ran a competition where participants in Amsterdam were invited to make something from pieces of zinc, showing not just design skills, but a certain craftability to sculpt this most malleable of metals. To really introduce this session, and I'll come back at the end for some questions, I'd like to welcome the Operational Marketing Manager of VM Zinc, Mr. Jonathan Lowy. Jonathan, hi.
Hello, Paul. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. I'm going to quickly introduce Diana Darke, who's really the main event today. I think it's going to be a fascinating talk. I have to thank my mother, who bought me Diana's book, Stealing from the Saracens, as a birthday present, and it really is very, very interesting indeed. Diana's an Arabist who has worked in the Middle East for over 30 years, and indeed she has a house in Damascus. She's written a number of books, with Stealing from the Saracens being the latest, which among other things highlights the interaction between culture, religion and architecture. So without further ado, over to you, Diana.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here and to be talking to an architectural audience, which is terrific, because I really would like the knowledge which is in this book to reach as wide an audience as possible. So let me just start by explaining the title. So, Stealing from the Saracens. Now, the word Saracens has been very deliberately chosen here because Christopher Wren, whose masterpiece there, St. Paul's on the right, is built, he tells us himself in his own words, using Saracen vaulting. And he explains why. He analyzes all the methods and said, I used it because it is the best. And so that's why the title of the cover of the book actually shows the inside dome of St. Paul's. And you can, just for those who might want to get the book, by the way, you go direct to the publishers, Hearst, and put in the code Saracens25 to get a 25% discount, and again gets sent anywhere in the world, wherever you may happen to be. So it's a very interesting thing that perhaps not many people realize, that so much of what we think of as Christian architecture actually originated in the East, in historic Syria. And when I say historic Syria, we must remember that up until World War I, Syria, the province of Syria, the Roman province of Syria, then the Ottoman province of Syria, was from the Taurus Mountains right down to the Sinai. So basically the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is where early Christianity developed. And so this is just a picture of the inside of St. Paul's to briefly show you the vaulting, which Christopher Wren said was Saracen. What he didn't know, of course, in the 17th century was that a lot of the other aspects of church architecture, so that the choir, the apse, the baldachin, all these elements also developed in Syria. And so here we are now looking at Syria. And what we're seeing here is the huge field of experimentation that where Roman pagan architecture made the transition into early Christian architecture. So what we have here in Syria, in northwest Syria, is an extraordinary collection, hundreds of settlements known collectively as the Dead Cities. And in the Dead Cities, there are over 2,000 churches, which very clearly then show that this transition into the earliest form of Christian architecture, which was basically from the sort of 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, is when we start to see things that we would recognize as a church. Before that, houses were used essentially. So here on the left is one of the most important of those churches in the Dead Cities. It's called Kalb Lawze. It was built in 460 and it's the earliest of what we now think of as Romanesque or Norman, this twin towers flanking a monumental arch. And this extraordinary building, which is still standing, and has survived earthquakes astonishingly through everything that's happened, was as I said, built in 460, and it was on a pilgrimage route to the place on the right-hand side there. The picture shows St. Simeon's Basilica. St. Simeon was an incredibly famous early monk, and the pilgrimage site, to go and hear him speak from the top of his pillar, it was the equivalent of the Santiago de Compostela of his day. I mean, the influence cannot be overstated. People would come from all over Europe to hear him preach. And this is just a detail I'm showing you now of the stonework in St. Simeon's Basilica. And just look at that incredible craftsmanship there. And this is to show you that Syria is limestone is the building material everywhere, and there's also some volcanic black basalt which affected the designs as well. But this because it is the local building material, the skills of the stonemasons go back centuries and centuries. I mean, to the beginning of time, basically. And look at those acanthus leaves are swaying in the wind. Syria is the only place where this kind of thing happens. It's not the same as Rome. What happens? Rome in the east takes on a whole new, much more exuberant type of carving, where the movement of nature and the focus on nature is very, very marked, completely different to what was happening in the Western Roman Empire. And this picture now I'm showing you, just to remind you that sadly, this area is actually still at war. I mean, this is the war is not over. St. Simeon's Basilica is on the edges of Idlib province. There are bombs all the time. So that beautiful acanthus capital that we looked at has now been scattered by Russian airstrikes, sadly, back in 2016. But the ground plan of St. Simeon's Basilica was the very first octagon within a cross over a centralized dome. And this is 50 years before Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So this area in Syria, if you like, is the huge backstory of Hagia Sophia. And here we now have some pictures of St. Simeon himself as he appeared in Europe, because, as I mentioned, pilgrims were coming back with souvenirs and with relics, and so the cult of St. Simeon grew up a lot in France. So there's 2 villages called St. Simeon named after him. Here's a stained glass window in one of the local churches. Icons on the right there were showing him on his pillar. There's one in Venice, in St. Mark's Basilica, showing him on his pillar as well. So that is the huge pre-Islamic inheritance that the Muslims took over when they came into Syria and made Damascus their capital. This is the Umayyad dynasty. So we're talking right at the end of the 7th century, and the very first architectural statement building that the Umayyads made was the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And you'll see how they blended the architecture. Basically, they borrowed from what was there before, so they've used the octagon shape, and they've been influenced by the churches that are all over Syria, but they've done something different with it. They've synthesized it, basically, into something different, because they've put all the color on the outside and all the decoration on the outside, along with a huge inscription admonishing Christians for believing in 3 gods in the Trinity. But also inside, there are extraordinary innovations, things that we have not seen before in Christian Byzantine architecture. At the bottom, there are the very first pointed arches that start to appear, and just below the dome at the top are the very first trefoil arches. And as we know, these are the very first elements of Gothic that come into architecture in Europe centuries later. Also, with the Umayyads, one of the other innovations that they introduced is what many scholars have recognized as the earliest rose window. This is from a palace called Khirbat al-Mafja in the occupied West Bank near Jericho, and it's been reconstructed, and it shows from the position where it was, high up in the audience hall, it was designed to let in decorative light, and fragments of stained glass have been found in the excavations. So this, if you like, is the sort of prototype, but what leads then 8 centuries later to the absolute pinnacle of stained glass windows in Chartres. So now, after the Umayyads, all these styles carried into Spain because when the Umayyad dynasty came to an end and the Abbasids came in, it was quite violent, but one Umayyad prince, against all the odds, managed to escape and make his way across North Africa into Andalusia. And he made Cordoba his capital, and this is the inside of the main vault in the Cordoba Mesquita, as it's still known today. And this astonishing piece of geometry is a ribbed vault, and so this is 10th century now. This is one of the extensions of the mosque. It was extended, first built in the 8th century and then extended in the 9th and 10th. And this astonishing piece of geometry was examined by academics in 2015, and they were flabbergasted. They had never seen anything like it. They said it's a geometrical masterpiece, and it has never needed repair, any kind of structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. And this essentially is because of the quality of the masons' work. At the back of the Cordoba Mesquita is this showcase of the masons' marks who built this building. And if you look at them, most of the names are Muslim, and so a few are Christian, but the overwhelming majority of the people working on these buildings, building these vaults, were Muslims who, of course, had carried their skills from Syria. And here's a detail of the mihrab inside the Cordoba Mesquita. So you can see the trefoil arches, which we first saw in the Dome of the Rock now, in a little arcade of them there, starting to look rather like Gothic architecture from the patterning. And so that, if you like, is Muslim Spain. What I'm going to show you now is how the pointed arch found its way into Europe. And again, this is well documented by the histories, the church histories that monks and abbots themselves recorded. So on the left here, we have Amalfi Cathedral. And around the year 1000, the Amalfi merchants were trading with the Eastern Mediterranean. And one of the places they went to regularly was Cairo. And in Cairo, they saw the pointed arches of the Ibn Tulun Mosque. And they brought this back and incorporated it into their cathedral. They imported the workmen and some of the raw materials. And then a very powerful Benedictine abbot came from Monte Cassino and visited Amalfi to buy some goods that were being traded. And he saw the pointed arches and thought, I like those. I want some of those in my monastery. So he also imported the labor and the raw materials and installed pointed arches in Monte Cassino. Then the abbot of Cluny, the absolute powerhouse of the Benedictines, visited Monte Cassino, saw the pointed arches there, and the result was this incredible building known as Cluny III, an incredibly, where the pointed arch was used in a monumental form for the first time. And so from there, it spread to Paris and became then the cornerstone. Everybody wanted it, basically. Once it became so popular with the it was a fashion, essentially. Once the top Benedictine monastery had it, then, of course, every bishop wanted it in his own town. So the style absolutely took off and coincided, of course, with a great deal of wealth after the Crusades, and the Spanish Reconquista, a lot of money. So the combination of money, the raw materials, and the beginnings of the technology then enabled this huge rash of Gothic cathedrals to be built. Now, here's another gateway through which these elements entered Europe. This is Sicily, in Palermo, the Cappella Palatina, where you have a synthesis again of Fatimid arches mixed with Byzantine mosaics and Muslim muqarnas, as they're known, another type of vaulting. Then you have Venice, incredibly influential. Now, the Venetians loved Islamic architecture. They went crazy for the arches everywhere, pointed, OG arches. You'll see that round circular telephone dial motif, as it's known in the central palace there, the Palazzo Dario. That is borrowed from a Mamluk palace in Cairo. And again, the Doge's palace on the right there, everything has been synthesized into this extraordinary new thing that they've adopted all the Islamic architecture very, very openly, all the elements that they've seen in their trades with the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, and have synthesized it into something new. And here on the left, we have Burgos Cathedral. And Burgos Cathedral is one of the buildings that Christopher Wren tells us is built in the Saracen style, because the way he describes the Saracen style is he says, you know, from this delicacy, the profusion, the extravagant fancy of its ornaments, he said, it could only be attributed to the Moors, or what is the same thing, to the Arabians or the Saracens, he says. So this is what this sort of very delicate stonework and tracery, all of these things can be traced back to the origins in Umayyad Syria. Now, on the right here, still in Spain, we have the Sagrada Familia, Antoni Gaudi, the most astonishing use of all these elements. Now, Gaudi was openly influenced by Islamic architecture. He loved it represents, if you like, a complete fusion of nature, geometry, and religion. And of course, it's still ongoing. It's not finished yet. It's still, it's not due to be completed until 2026, the centenary of Gaudi's death, but it is the most remarkable example of a sort of organic structure, this use of nature and this sort of almost fractal geometry where God is thought to reside in the sort of transition zone, if you like, in the sort of imperfections, and this all of this sort of philosophy, if you like, is very tied up with the way Muslims think about the internal space as well. So now, of course, the Gothic revival takes place and starts to sprout all over key buildings in the 19th century. So our Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, covered in trefoil arches, pointed arches. And this is, after all, our seat of government. And it made its way across the Atlantic to America. Gothic was incredibly popular in universities, colleges, and schools, more popular than anywhere else in the world. And here we have Yale campus, Yale University campus. On the left there is the Harkness Tower, and on the right, looking for all the world like a Gothic nave, is the library, astonishingly. So Gothic, really important. And then to end on, the US Capitol Dome in Washington, which, if you like, is the sort of iconic structure representing American government. I mean, it's their equivalent of our Houses of Parliament, if you like, also uses inside the technology, the Islamic technology, invented first of all by the Seljuks, and which Wren himself uses inside the dome. So even though we're looking at what appears to be a straightforward classical piece of architecture, underneath it's hiding something which is completely different from another part of the world. And that's really my point, that everything builds on everything else. I mean, the book is a kind of plea for multiculturalism, because you have to take the best from everything. So like Wren did, I mean, he acknowledged that the Saracen vaulting was the best, so that's what he wanted to have, and he synthesized it into something new. And it's this whole thing of synthesizing. Wren himself was the arch synthesizer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. That was fascinating, and I think we're going to see that there's an awful lot of connections actually about what you've talked about and what I'm going to talk about in a brief presentation about zinc, which does go around the world, and you'll see has a lot of connections. And then I think we're going to get an opportunity to do a bit of Q&A. So as I said, I'm going to talk about how zinc connects with some of the past and also a little bit of the present. Bend me, shape me any way you want me is something that Paul Finch will recognize. It was an American Breed song in the 60s and refers to the flexibility of zinc, not only in its malleability and workability, but also in the type of architecture it's used with. There are some theories that the Acropolis had a zinc or a zinc alloy roof. There's no absolute proof of that, but zinc was found in the ruins of Pompeii. So it has been around for quite a long time. Moving forward though, on the bottom left is actually a village in southern France called Conques. Diana mentioned pilgrimages, and this is one of the main routes on the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. And this church was called Saint Foy, was originally built by monks fleeing the Moors from Spain in the 8th century. It happened to be in a part of France where there's an awful lot of coal and minerals. And VM Zinc built a rolling mill in the middle of the 19th century, which still exists and still produces zinc that is then sent around the world, including into projects such as this one, which is it's not the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It's a slightly more modern mosque with many domes, many minarets, all clad in zinc, in this case in pre-weathered zinc. Keeping in the dome idea, not quite a dome. This is a building in a place where we should have been, Lisbon, and hopefully we will be in June. It's an arena built by SOM over 25 years ago. And it does in some way address one of the concerns that Christopher Wren had, which was about how weight and structure can affect aesthetics. The advantage of zinc as compared with lead that I mentioned at the Hagia Sophia is that it's much lighter. So you can have a much lighter structure, maybe a more elegant structure, as you can see on the left side, wooden structure then clad again with standing seam zinc roofing. Lots of domes exist in zinc, not only just zinc, but also combining with other materials. This is the Grand Palais in Paris, zinc, glass, steel. And on the right, you can see some of the ornaments, which again reflect some of the things that might have come from the East. They're quite similar in some of the stonework that Diana highlighted in Syria. So there's probably something that's been taken from that part of the world. Another thing that's been taken from that part of the world is the idea of craftsmanship. Craftsmen plied their trade, moving around, learning their trade in the Middle East, but that tradition started in Europe as well. And the Compagnons de Devoir, which started in the 13th century and still exists, is really a way of craftsmen learning their trade, traveling around the country, learning techniques. And one of the trades is roofing and zinc roofing, and that still exists to this day. And the craft of a zinc roofer is something that is absolutely key. Keeping in with the sort of tower and spire theme, one of the first zinc projects of modern era, and when I say the modern era, I'm meaning 1809, is a church in Liège in Belgium, which was, as I said, built in 1809. But many spires and towers are clad in zinc, and the photo in the middle is a fairly traditional spire in Switzerland, and on the right something a little bit more contemporary, but both clad in zinc. And then again, a church. This has to me, it has a bit of a feel of Le Corbusier, which I think Diana mentions in her book, was possibly influenced on his travels. He spent time in southeastern Europe, in Istanbul, before the First World War. So this church has a bit of that feel, but the zinc again is used in a very curved way, cladding surfaces which are quite curved in many directions. But zinc's not only used on curved buildings, also fairly angular buildings. And yet again, here is a connection to the past. This is Wadham College in Oxford, where not only did Diana study, but also Christopher Wren. And this is a building that was designed, new halls of residence by Eliza Morrison's a couple of years ago, again clad in zinc standing seam roofing. It's difficult to talk about zinc and history of zinc without mentioning this man, Baron Haussmann, who redeveloped Paris in the middle of the 19th century with the grand boulevards, which are still very, very visible today. In fact, central Paris has not changed that much since 1860, 1870. You can see at the top left there's the Arc de Triomphe, then there's the Gare du Nord, the Gare de Lyon. The left is the Halles, which have changed, but much of central Paris, the grand boulevards, have remained as they were, clad with zinc roofs. And even there's a building, this is actually the Basilique of Saint-Denis in the suburbs of Paris. And obviously that building has been around a very, very long time and has changed very little. But what has changed in Paris is some of the housing estates, which are not the greatest, large concrete towers, which have lost the sense of community. They're really sort of a lot of social problems. And over the last decade or two, authorities have started to try and address some of these problems. This is actually a building in the center, which was built only about 5 years ago, only a mile from the Basilica of Saint-Denis. And it's a much smaller scale development, maybe going back to more not only European traditions, but also Middle Eastern traditions of having, whether it be churches, mosques, schools, shops nearby. And this is a mixed-use building with residential and some other types of mixed-use shops and so on. And it's actually clad in something called azingar, which is engraved zinc. Zangar is Persian for zinc, which is yet another connection. Now, I'm just going to give a very quick run through zinc projects around the world, just to give you a bit of flavour of what's been done over the last few years. This is in Brooklyn by Shop Architects. So zinc has been used here to clad the outside of a building as using a rain screen. In Hong Kong, this is the Kennedy swimming pool complex by Terry Farrell, again going back to the curved shapes that you saw before. And staying in the curve theme, this is a port building in Limassol in Cyprus. This building actually won the Mies van der Rohe Prize in 2017. And here is a building on the Danube in Austria, an art gallery in Krems, again using the engraved zinc, the azingar, in quite a contemporary, striking way, in a fairly conservative part of the world, but that follows, it's quite a common theme in Austria, some quite striking architecture in fairly traditional areas. And then we've got not quite mosaics, not quite stained glass, but it is possible to use, to color zinc, to give it a slight color, and to use small panels that give this sort of texture and clad very interesting forms. Now, just to end on, a little bit like Diana did, indeed. This is Charterhouse School in Surrey, south of London, which most of the buildings were neo-Gothic, so in the middle of the 19th century, and Design Engine were commissioned to build a new science block, which had to fit in with the architecture, but in a slightly more contemporary way. So again, trying to mix things, have a reference back to the neo-Gothic architecture with a sort of the vertical windows, and there are some steep roofs, as you can see on the chimneys on the right. So hopefully that's given you a very, very brief run through of what zinc can do. Obviously, if you do need more information, because there's a lot more that can be discussed concerning techniques and systems, we'd be very happy to speak to you. But I'm going to hand back to Paul now, because I'm sure there's going to be a question or two. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Two fascinating presentations, both in terms of geography and particularly in history. And Diana, if I can kick off with a question to you from Stefan Schmid. Is there influence of the Persians in your book or in your subject?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes, I mean, you can't escape the fact that there's, we think in terms of all our modern borders these days, but what is currently Iran and what is currently Syria, all blended into each other basically. So yes, huge amounts of influence, obviously. So the Masons I was talking about in Syria, I mean, the Romans, the Byzantines were constantly fighting the Persians, the Sassanids, and as they were at that time, and so all these influences came in, and they've been identified. So scholars have looked at some of the detailed carving that we see in stone on some of the front buildings, and have identified a particular mythical beast, which is from Persia, for example. So yes, all of these things. It's fascinating to see how pretty much all of the designs traced back to Iran and what was essentially ancient Mesopotamia, where civilization began. That's it's hardly surprising in a way.
Thank you very much. And another one for you, Diana. This is from Christiane Briones, and she makes the point that historically, the sort of people that we would today describe as architects were master masons. I suppose this links actually to Jonathan's point about the 13th century origins of the craftspeople who make zinc roofs. So her question is, do we have any records of master masons that identify who they were and where they came from?
Well, this is a fascinating subject and a fascinating question, because so much work is now being done for the first time on these sorts of areas. So more and more is being discovered. So literally just a couple of days ago, I was reading a learned academic article about Sicily, about Palermo, that has found that Muslim masons were brought over to work on these buildings. And of course, we're talking, Sicily was under the Normans at that time. And of course, the Normans then came and conquered England, 1066 and all that, and brought in to England all our Gothic cathedrals. They even imported the stones. So many of these early methods and the level of craftsmanship, because of their superior education and mastery of geometry. That's what set the Muslim masons apart. And some of them were brought over by crusaders as prisoners. There again, these are recorded. Incidentally, that my book is fully footnoted, so the sources of all this information are given. So, but yes, more and more is emerging. I mean, I'm on the hunt at the moment for. Somebody's told me about some Arabic writing which has been found during repair work at Durham Cathedral. Now, of course, Durham is always held out as the earliest ribbed vault. Well, I'm personally convinced, but I have to prove it somehow, that this was as a result of Muslim masons. And the Norman who the Bishop of Durham, William de St. Calais, his name was a Norman knight who had just been on a campaign in Sicily and had brought back Muslim masons. So I mean, you can't explain the sudden leap in the sudden advance, in stone craftsmanship, where the knowledge of geometry was so vital. I mean, it can only be explained by things like there's people coming in who had that knowledge and who were then able to pass it over to their Christian counterparts.
There was a fascinating slide you showed of, it looked rather like a data set, but it was the marks that the Masons had left on, I assume, individual tablets, but no names. Is there a reason for this? Was there some sort of religious objection to the identification of individual humans with religious buildings?
Absolutely not. No, no. And there are names. Among those Masons, they're not all just Masons' marks. I mean, a few of them are sort of like abbreviated signatures, but they're not just marks. I mean, these Muslim Masons were well educated by and large. I mean, they could actually write their names, and so their names appear. You'll see Muhammad, you'll see Abdurrahman. No, I mean, they want to be remembered. Of course, their masters weren't so keen on them being remembered. And of course, it tends to be in the repair work down in the foundations, or whatever, that this kind of stuff is then stumbled upon. I mean, I'm rather hopeful that in Notre Dame, in all the work that's going to be done there, that something may be found in the whole rebuilding process there that may link us back in a very concrete way, that it gives us the proof that we're looking for, that we kind of know is there. We just have to find it.
Now, I've got a question for you, Jonathan, from Tarek Mokhtar, and he would like to know whether there were reasons other than function, cost, utility, why people would use zinc as opposed to other materials.
Why to use zinc? Well, there's, I suppose that the key reason today why zinc is used is aesthetics. So it's the visual aesthetic that the material gives to the outside of the building. But quite quickly, when a designer, an architect, a building owners thought about aesthetics, you get issues of durability, of maintenance, of recyclability, of performance, whether it be wind, rain, even, and today, obviously, fire's been discussed a lot more. So you start with the aesthetics, but then quite quickly, people want to know how it's going to perform from a durability and maintenance standpoint. But I would say the aesthetics is the key starter.
But was that true? Was that true in the 13th century?
Oh, well, no, going back to the 13th century, the Compagnons de Devoir, who started the roofing side of it, they were not using zinc as far as we know. The zinc in modern times, I mean, there are the theories about the Acropolis and Pompeii, but zinc in modern times started in the beginning of the 19th century. And it was produced as a material actually by a monk in Belgium who didn't really know what to do with it. And one of the first uses was to make a bathtub for Napoleon, which was carried all the way to Moscow and all the way back again. And then somebody thought, right, well, we can do other things other than make bathtubs. And this is where St. Bartholomew's Church in Liège used zinc for the first time. And I think it was almost sort of experimental. And we thought, we've got this material, what are we going to do with it? Bathtubs, roofs. Our roofs work well. And then it went on from there. And before Haussmann, it started being used in Paris in the early 19th century. I think there was a desire for Paris not to look too much like an Italian city, which is obviously often uses copper. So it was there and it was appropriate.
Well, I love the story of the bathtub, and I've been fascinated, Diana, by your wonderful kind of explanation of these cross-cultural influences. I remember the exhibition about Venice and Islam, and the way that it showed that the deeper you go into history, the more complex it becomes. And it was only the modernists who tried to simplify everything, actually really without success. Jonathan and Diana, can I thank you both for excellent contributions today? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.